our first talk of the morning. Our presenter today will be Mr. Paul Works. Paul currently serves as Director, Analytic Data and Development Group, the Research and Analysis Center. Will be Mr. Paul Works. Paul currently serves as Director. Oh, pardon me, we have a little technical difficulty there. Paul currently serves as Director, Analytic Data and Development Group, the Research and Analysis Center at Fort Leavenworth. He is responsible for TRAC Flynn workforce professional development, analytic best practices, and standards development, enabling analytic and business process innovations and establishing a robust and enduring enterprise data management capability. Paul has worked for 34 years as a federal civilian for the Navy and Army. He spent 11 years doing air-to-air and air-to-ground tactics and conceptual systems development, working with Top Gun, Fleet, and Aggressor Squadron pilots. The last 23 years, he has worked for TRAC, leading major analytic studies, scenario development, and wargaming, working with uniformed soldiers, civilians, and contractors. He has been gaming for nearly 50 years and is a published game designer with Multiman Publishing and Advanced Squad Leader. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Yep. So welcome to everybody. This morning, I'll be giving you an overview of a war game we did for the Civil Affairs Proponent as part of their force modernization assessment that we conducted in 2019. And you'll see these are the main organizations that were involved. At the time, TRAC, the Research Analysis Center, was currently we're part of the Army Futures Command, which is a split off major command from TRADOC, the Army Training and Doctrine Command. And at the time we did this, we were part of one of the subordinate elements called the Future Concept Center. That's what that FCC is in the middle. Recently, we moved up to be a direct reporting unit under the headquarters AFC. But so what I'll be doing today is I'll be giving you an overview of what we thought through, why we considered a war game to support this force modernization assessment, and how that war game was designed, and then some of the outputs that came from the war game. So next slide, please, Sean. So here's the list of what we're going to be talking about. I'll give you an overview of what the whole project was about, a little bit of the background about what CA is all, Civil Affairs is all about, and then then talk about when we were doing the functional solutions analysis, the FSA event, why we settled on a war game at that point, and then we'll go into the war game structure and design and so forth, and then we'll go into some of the products, and you'll see some of these products down there on the bottom, and then we'll end up with a summary, and then whatever, if you all have some questions, I can certainly respond to those. All right, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the current Civil Affairs force structure. They have a large proportion of the Civil Affairs structure is within the reserves, and so you see on the left-hand side, all those are reserve elements, and then there's only one brigade that's active duty, and then one additional battalion. And so you'll see kind of in the middle of the screen there, the first SF AP. That's the Civil Affairs, soft Civil Affairs, airborne qualified units that are the active duty elements. There's another battalion, this ForceCom element in the middle, that has a number of companies that are also active duty. And each one of the subordinate elements underneath each that battalion and that brigade are aligned with some COCOM. And you can see the coloring of those. And so each one is specializes in that COCOM. And and they're either forward deployed in the case of the FORCECOM units, or they are deployable as required as far as the 18th Airborne Corps, the 1st SF group there in the middle. And then there's some support elements that are also aligned with different groups, different COCOMs. And so part of the challenge for the civil affairs proponent as a whole is because the 80% of their force is in the reserves, and they have a direct commission thing, kind of like medical doctors have, where if you get a medical degree, you can come in as a captain or even higher, I guess, in some cases. And they have a similar deal in the civil affairs branch, where if you come in as a specialist in some civil service area, you can come in as a higher rank. But the challenge is okay, well, then how do they, one of the challenges is how do they make sure that everyone has equivalent training and experience in the areas that they're focused on. So anyway, that was one of the challenges, and there's a number of other challenges as well that we'll talk a little about later. All right, next slide, please. There must be a slight delay in the slides flipping, so there we go. All right, so here's some background. Back in 2005, there was that was the last extensive redesign of the CA force structure, and they had identified some capability gaps, and then they modified the CA force to mitigate a number of those. Then in 2012, there was another civil affairs capability-based assessment conducted. And a capability-based assessment, which we'll talk about a little briefly about in another slide following here. That's what is done typically when you want to start looking at a DOTML examination of a force. So you examine what the current capabilities, current required capabilities are. You examine how those capabilities match up against the anticipated requirements, and then you identify solutions. And so that's what a capabilities-based assessment is. This force modernization assessment that we did starting in 2019 is the same thing, except we looked at a little bit of a sufficiency analysis in terms of numbers of units in addition to just the rest of the DOTML pieces. And so then again, we started this, the USASOC, the civil affairs proponent at USASOC, published this Civil Affairs 2025 and Beyond white paper that was part of the suite of papers that proponents were asked to put out in support of multi-domain operations. And then based upon that white paper, which was the core element of the analysis we were going to be doing, we kicked off this Civil Affairs Force Modernization Assessment. All right, next slide, please. All right, so here's a little bit of an overview of the Civil Affairs white paper. What really it's focused on is, and as all these new concepts were focused on, is supporting the Army's new operating concept. And the Army's new operating concept is called multi-domain operations. And you'll see MDO in several places throughout the briefing, but that's what it is. And multi-domain operations isn't so much a complete reshaping of air-land battle, which was the Army's previous operating concept. But what it does is it talks about, it brings in the cyber domain, the information domain, and talks about, it kind of brings it up at least to the edge of the Army doctrine up to the 21st century, and then has hooks in for enabling or add-on capabilities as those technologies and associated doctrine emerge. So so what this white paper did was it aligned the civil affairs force and doctrine, or propose that redesign to match multi-domain operations. All right, next slide, please. So one of the big, this is a structure, methodology of a typical capabilities-based assessment, or in this force modernization assessment. And each one of those, one of those studies, there's these three main components. So you have these inputs, the white paper and the current doctrine and emergent threats and so on. And then you have these three big workshops or areas. You have the functional area analysis, the functional needs analysis, and the functional solution analysis. And the area analysis, and you can read these in the slides, but what the area analysis does is it says, okay, this is the kind of capabilities that we need to have in the future. And so we know from proposed scenarios, proposed threat documents, and so on, and other lit sources, that this is what the environment's going to be. And by future, I mean 2028, 2035, and then in some cases beyond that. In this case, we used 2035 or so, 2028, 2035. Then we do a function. Once you get that, you say, okay, these are the required capabilities. Then you do the FNA, which looks at, okay, this is what our known current capabilities are, and this is how they vet against those identified required capabilities. And then based on that, you identify capability gaps. And then also, if there are times when you identify capability redundancies that you can mitigate as well. But primarily it's gaps. And so you say, okay, here's these gaps in these different capability areas. And then based on those gaps, and then you do a risk assessment of the gaps to say, hey, this is the highest, most threatening gap, et cetera. And then you do the FSA, which says, okay, these are the set of proposed solutions that we have to mitigate those gaps. Then we assess those solutions in some kind of environment against the gaps, and then we come up with a prioritized list that then we recommend for DOTML change. And the doctrine, or DOTML stands for doctrine, organization, training, materiel, leadership and education, personnel, facilities, and policy. So within the civil affairs force, the proponent, the solutions went across all those DOTML letters, basically areas. And so you propose some doctrine or non-materiel solutions, and then you may propose some new materiel solutions which go a different route in the future, the defense acquisition system. All right. So as we went into this, one of the things we identified early on. Next slide, please. One of the things we identified early on was there's had been in the past kind of a circular nature of civil affairs and how they communicated what they did. So one common thing you would hear, or just alluded in the doctrine, or hear when people in civil affairs folks would talk about it, and they were just using their doctrine, was that civil affairs civil affairs mission was to do civil affairs. So there's this kind of circular argument. There was no real hard line described link to fully enabling the supported commanders. And so that's one of the things we identified early on is, hey, we need to change. We need to help you guys change your narrative about what civil affairs is all about. And so as we went forward through the project, that's part of the piece we focused on. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is even though TRAC we were the lead analytic group, but the co-lead of the project was a civil affairs proponent. They have a futures division there, and the civil affairs proponent, which is one of the pieces underneath USASOC and the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School. And so that we were co-leads on the effort as a whole. I just wanted to make sure, pointed that out. All right. So as we went through that FAA, FNA, FSA process, when we got to the solution analysis step, we had to figure out how to compare the different solutions, how to compare and examine the effectiveness and the utility of the different proposed solutions. And those proposed solutions were across all those DOTML things. So the question is, well, how do you compare a doctrine change, the effectiveness of that versus, let's say, a personnel change or a policy change or whatever, any one of those? What's the kind of dichotomous comparison of capabilities to do that? Well, so we examine a number of different ways of thinking about that, and you can see these options down here. So there's different types of, there's the MADAM, the multi-attribute decision making, and the board account, and there's other types of comparative analytic techniques we considered. But I'll admit I was a little bit non-objective anyway, but because I'm a war gamer. But wargaming for me and the rest of the team was the best solution. So we thought, okay, well, one of the things we want to understand is which we don't understand is how do those different proposed capabilities interact? How do they interact with the environment and each other and the supported commander, and then build then with the players' discussions, the subject matter experts' discussions, is to dig down into why they're not just like have some numbers that say this is 75% better, but rather find out why it was better, or why something worked better, or maybe even if it didn't work better. What if there was confounding effects that, okay, we do both these solutions and it doesn't, they don't work together, or hey, if we're going to do solution A, really you can't do solution A until you do solution D. There's like a precedence order of solutions you have to do. So anyway, we settled on a war game, and one of the piece structures that we use at TRAC in the Army is this concept called measurement space, where we look at the problems, the gaps that we've identified, and then we set those problems within the conditions that those problems exist, and then we examine the solutions, the proposed solutions within that overlap. So that little semi-triangle there in the middle is what we call the measurement space. That's where we want to focus on to find to try to distinguish between the potential solutions. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so then after selecting a war game as the base structure for the functional solution analysis, we said, okay, well, how are we going to? We thought through how are we going to build a war game? What are we going to do to represent civil affairs? Not only do we have to represent civil affairs in supporting some combat operation, as an example, but really civil affairs. One of the big deals within civil affairs is that you have to support the competition part of the multi-domain operations continuum. So like multi-domain operations, MDO, structures, there's a competition phase, there's which replaces the old phase 0, phase 1 kind of phase, and the old warfighting construct. And then they have an armed conflict phase, which is the phase 3, phase 2, phase 3. And then there's the return to competition phase. And all the time we're in conflict or competition. So at all points we're in right now we're in competition with our adversaries. So civil affairs, they have a big role in that competition phase. So how we had to, when we do a war game, we have to include that element within here, within the examination. So as we thought through the different pieces and based on a lot of it, this proposed solution structure, we came to the conclusion that we're going to have to do 3 different levels of war game. We're going to have to do a strategic level war game, an operational level war game, and a tactical level war game. And so based on that, then we said, okay, then now we're going to have to flesh that war game, what the design of those war games are. And so on the right-hand side of this slide, you see the war game design development process, which is a structure that we use at TRAC a lot, and based off of Peter Perla's structure, and I took a little bit of Dunnigan and added it in there. And then for some application for TRAC specifically, but you can see the kind of structure and the considerations we use. And so we use that whenever we build a war game at TRAC to think through how to design it and develop it. And then there was a series of engagements that we did with the other team members and the civil affairs soldiers. We brought them in and we brainstormed the structure, and then we designed it, and then did some play testing and did development over a series of meetings down at Fort Bragg. And one of the key piece is having those civil affairs folks as part of it. So we as war game SMEs, with some of us with military background, we can design the game, but for us it's always highly valuable to have the specific subject matter experts involved in it, and they fully embraced the war game structure and were key facilitators and developers of the whole structure as a whole. All right, next slide, please, Sean. All right, so I'm going to talk through each one of the levels of war games now that we had, and talk to you a little bit about what we did in each one of those. We'll start with the strategic war game. So in this one, you see a EUCOM map on the left, but we also had a map of the United States that showed where mobilization centers were and where active duty and reserve component civil affairs assets are located in the United States. And so with these guys, when the strategic war game, each one of these, we ran these war games simultaneously. So in one room of the facility, we had a team of a couple TRAC folks, several civil affairs proponents folks, and then a 10 to 15 civil affairs SMEs players in each one of those rooms. And those players represented different roles depending on the echelon level of the war game. And they represent different roles. And then they would discuss what their actions were as the base scenario progressed. So we used a base scenario structure that is designed for the EUCOM AO, and we just walked our way through that. And then they would talk about what actions civil affairs would have to do, and the application of these different proposed solutions. And so for the strategic war game, it was all about, okay, mobilizing, what kind of personnel fill do we have? What kind of assets do we have? How do we get them deployed? How do we get them to the theater? Those kinds of big questions, all the kinds of things you would anticipate at the strategic level. And you can see on the right-hand side the kinds of activities that they would be considering. Each game turn in this scenario, this type of scenario, this scenario echelon, were 1 to 2 months per game turn. And in each war game run, we did, I don't know, 6 game turns maybe of play. All right, next slide, please. So the next war game we did that I'll describe here is the operational level war game. And so this shows that. And this is, at this point, we drilled specifically down into the EUCOM AO, and we talked about kind of regional activities and once the civil affairs forces got into there's some 4 deployed civil affairs assets, and then, as I mentioned before, a lot of the civil affairs assets are reserve components. So once some kind of conflict is getting ready to start, they have to mobilize, and then they have to get deployed to theater, trained, and then deployed to theater, and then get moved from their deployment locations in theater to the actual AO where the operations are taking place. So there's this whole dynamic of having to do that. And so what we did here is we examined, we used a kind of a zonal structure where each zone was generally a country. And in each one of those zones, we looked at different different PMISI level civil affairs related civil sectors. And so those boxes, and we'll drill down a couple of slides with those little boxes, those show the civil affairs structures. And then we monitored the state of those structures, whether they were supporting the adversary, supporting the blue guys, the friendly forces, or if they were damaged and so forth. And so we monitored the state of the environment using those state metrics, those state measures. And you can see that it was 1 to 2 turns a game, 1 to 2 weeks a game turn. And then movement between these was just between these zones, so these countries. And you can see again on the right the kinds of operations and considerations they were using. All right, next slide, please. So the next one will be the tactical war game. And here it's just another drill down. And so in this case, we drilled down in great detail down to what was happening at the tactical level. And that maybe one of those, depending on the excursion we were playing, that map size was maybe 50 kilometers, maybe 30 kilometers in this case. And so in this case, the structure was an arc node construct. So each one of those boxes, like groups of little boxes you can see on the right on the map, was a node. And then the roads, generally the road networks, were the arcs. So assets had to move across from node to node and across those arcs. We did allow them some cross-country non-arc movement in certain cases, and so we played that in as well. And then again, each one of those nodes, we tracked the state of the environment, the state of the civil networks, the support, and then the state of the security in the environment, and so on. And we'll drill down in that detail later on. And at this point, we were looking at civil affairs teams, so soft civil affairs teams, and Compo 3 or active non-soft civil affairs teams as well. And then we looked at company and battalion, brigade enabling assets. And then you can, as could be expected, that types of activities they would conduct in this kind of war game were very tactically level oriented, like, hey, we're going to engage with some civil affairs or civil network point of contact we know, or we're going to try to search an area, like the soft guys, to search an area to identify adversary soft for activities, etc. All right, next slide. So when we went through there, here's a structure, some structural elements of what the war game piece looked like. So we had a sequence of play, like in most war games. All war games, there's a sequence of play that we use, and I'm not going to describe every single one of these. But then on the bottom left, you can see the structure of the OE, the operational environment state measures. So this is for the tactical war game, and you can see that the 5 state measures we used to represent each the state of each node. And so there was the infrastructure and essential services state, the security, civil networks, economy, and then government control. And that means the local government control of what was taking place. And then we use these cubes. We used the playing pieces on the tactical and operational level war game were like gaming pieces. They were little blocks of wood that we had the icons of the units and so forth on them that the players would move around. And then the state measures, we used these little colored cubes to represent in different colors. So we had black, red, green, and yellow, and that would show the current. You can immediately, when looking at the map, see the current state of the environment and where each player, the assets would have to execute different operations on the next game turn and so forth. And then the state of the environment would impact how well the Blue Force operations would be able to be conducted. So enabling the supported commander, so to speak. So in addition to the tactical level assets that the players could apply, they also had the top right shows this capability, this reach back or enabling asset capabilities that were provided by higher level echelons. So we had these capability points that represented different assets they could apply. So if you had, let's say you had 10 civil affairs teams doing operations, you could apply some of these resources to modify the success probability of different operations that the civil affairs teams were executing. And so once you executed one, you just, you'd go down, you'd mark off, you use one of those capability points. And then depending on the solutions that were applied, we had different levels. So that the blue ones were for the more robust capability sets that were allowed, and the green ones were so on. And then the white allowed ones were for the ones that without any additional proposed solutions. And so we had this structure. we used for that. In addition, we monitored the whole host nation population stance over time, and that's what that middle thing was, and that affected how well operations could be conducted as well. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this slide shows the run design. So when we do a war game, one of the considerations with war games is a lot of times people think a TRAC is one example is, hey, when we do a war game, we can get a bunch of numbers out of the war game, and then we can use those war game numbers as statistics. Well, that's challenging to do, especially, as I'm sure you all know, it's challenging to do when you only run one war game, and let's say you only have the resources to execute one iteration of the war game, and you can't bring everybody together for 10 straight weeks, for example. And then in addition, if the war game is stochastic, like if you have die rolls or probabilities, then that has even a more compounding effect. And so the ability to get highly statistical numbers is challenging. And so, and then in addition, maybe you have a whole wide range of different excursions, like little scenario vignettes you want to examine the solutions against, and you have different types of proposed solutions. So those were all the different considerations we had to think about when we put together what we called a run design. And so the run design was looking at the different types of proposed solutions, the specifically examined areas we wanted to examine, and then what war game room, the working group, the strategic war game, operational or tactical, what war game group they were being played in. And so we had these excursions. And so what this did was we said, okay, we're going to examine, for example, I'll just go on the first row. We're going to, on run 3 in the strategic working group, that's S3, that's the multiple compo examination application of solutions. But we're going to examine civil knowledge management integration in detail, and then the civil knowledge management and integration details also going to be examined in the operational working group in their excursion 1 and 2, and in the tactical working group in their excursion 1.1 and 1.2. So what you try to do is you try to build this as orthogonal as you can get a set of examinations of the same kinds of considerations, so you can get multiple looks to try to see the solution interaction and the problem interaction from different viewpoints. And then you can start putting together not so much statistical stuff, but a consolidated narrative. And so that's what this run design was for, this design of experiments. All right, next slide, please. All right, so then as we went through here, after we ran the war game, we examined the wide range of different solutions. And what this shows is, after we examined the results from the war game and then some other analyses we did in conjunction with the war game for the functional solution analysis step of the FMA, we came up with some prioritized solutions to mitigate the high risk gaps, capability gaps. And then in addition, we thought through some precedence order and which solutions would be more easily implemented, which could be controlled in-house more so by the civil affairs proponent, so they would not require a substantial amount of funding or any like organizational change, or certainly no personnel change that would require more numbers. And so these were grouped into what were called capability sets, and you can see those as those bars, kind of the vertical bars. So we have the current state, and then we have the IOC, the initial operational capability state, and then the future operational capability set. And then we had these solution packages, which were, hey, these are all the ones we're going to do in-house within the civil affairs proponent. These are the ones that are currently within the Army inventory that we can leverage. These IMTO are the ones that we have to change, particularly materiel within the civil affairs organization. And then the ones that are PPBE and the POM ones, those are the ones that are going to require funding and multi-year efforts to get those resourced. And so there kind of went from top at left down to the bottom right for implementation in phase to get executed. All right, next slide, please. So then we did using the assessments we did during the war game, and we had a lot of data collectors. And then at the end of each day, we assessed the solution packages and the proposed solutions. We collected data. We had a very structured data collection process, and then using the other analysis we did a risk reduction analysis against the identified capability gaps. So initially, there were 33 extremely high risk, we call tier 1 capability gaps, and you can see those on the left set of bar charts there, set bars. And then with the application of the IOC capabilities, which we just talked about in the previous slide, all the gaps have been mitigated, at least partially. Not fully mitigated, but at least they've been reduced in severity. Then when we apply the FOC capabilities, and this is without any organization change, then you do shift it over to be these orange and pink levels over to the lighter orange and yellow levels. And then if you're able to at some point fully implement the recommended FOC capabilities, then you fully mitigate all the gaps, or at least nearly fully mitigate all the gaps. And so that's what this flow shows, how the solutions mitigate the high risk gaps. All right, next slide, please. So then, as I've talked about a little bit before, there are two slides that look very similar. So we built the value of the war game is we did get some kind of numbers looking prioritization survey results like you saw on the previous slide, but we also could build these narratives talking about how the civil affairs should communicate what they're doing and how they're really enabling the supported commander. So we have an IOC capability set narrative, and then the next slide, which I'll just touch on briefly, is the FOC capability set narrative. But then, so we showed, okay, this is what civil affairs should be saying they're doing, and these are the capabilities that are being provided. So in this case, we're changing the focus from civil affairs exist to do civil affairs, to no, civil affairs are focused on enabling the supported commander, specifically to achieve their missions. And you can see these supporting pieces of that. And then these are all for the civil affairs proponent folks, these are all the kind of the key elements that are part of that enabling the supported commander. And I'm not going to talk all the little boxes on there, but you can read them yourself if you want. And then this is just a genericized AO that we use for this diagram. All right, so the next slide, FOC, and I'll just touch on this briefly. So now we're going from civil affairs, we're focused on enabling supported commander. Now when you apply the FOC capability set, now what you have is a civil affairs component of the force that is fully integrated into all the decisions that the commander is making, to the immediate decisions and the in-state decisions that commander has to consider to fully achieve his final desired end state. So, for example, they're not like in the IOC, they're providing information to do civil engagements and telling the supported commander when there might be problems with roads or power grids or let's say crowds or whatever. In this case, the maneuver force commander will leverage the civil affairs people to make changes in the civil environment that will enable his or her future operations. So it's a more fully integrated capability, and that's what the FOC, the added capabilities provides. All right, next slide, please. So as part of the changes that were implemented, so one cool thing, and this doesn't often happen with projects, but within this project, because the civil affairs was the lead for it, the proponent was the lead for it, and a lot of the solutions, as I showed you on a previous slide, were identified as in-house solutions. they could immediately start making changes. Once their leadership agreed that with the results of the study, then they started making the changes. And one of the changes they've got the near final draft of their doctrine document written. They're implementing training and other changes that are associated with that, and they're building other doctrine documents that will have cascading effects on training and personnel and so forth as well. And so one of the pieces, this is really for the civil affairs, in every doctrine document, the new ones, the FMs, they have a diagram that looks like this. That's called a logic chart, and it shows the flow of how civil affair, whatever the proponent is, a warfighting function, how it is executed, what are the main component pieces, and then how it supports the commander. And so that's what this flow chart does. And so this is just an example of what how the civil affairs has been modified. And these circled numbers are the key change areas within that doctrine document. All right, next slide, please. And then this slide shows the Army's, one of the Army's favorite ways of showing things is the ends, ways, and means structure. And so that's what this piece. And so all these different means, these this DOTML PF change elements on the left, and then the activities they're doing, the ways that they're doing, and these are the updated main task areas that civil affairs will be executing. And then on the right is, okay, this is what they're doing to enable a supported commander specifically. And so it's not just to do civil affairs, it's to, hey, we're doing them to make sure that we enable that supported commander, and we support the population that they're engaging with. All right, next slide. So then, in summary, we executed this FMA, leveraging a war game. You can see the time period we executed in. The results have been approved up to the deputy CG of AFC, and then a number of these solutions have already been starting to be implemented. And then hooks are being put in place to do those other solution packages, which require a little bit more active effort and resourcing to be implemented. And so and this is one of the cool things is when you're more closely touching the soldiers or the sailors or the airmen, is we actually got some changes implemented. So not only did we do this study, it wasn't 3 or 4 levels removed from the soldier. We actually got some change done, and that's going to help the future Army force be more effective across its missions and executing its getting to their desired end states. So with that, that's the end of the presentation. So I could take any questions if people have questions, specific ones. Yes. So that's a good question. So you can see the question on the screen there. So it was we were very pleased. So the civil affairs proponent folks, it's interesting. So for the first couple of months, it took us, all us kind of mathematical ORSA types, a little bit of time to understand how civil affairs folks speak. We talked in a little slightly different language, but once we got hooked in with them, and it took just a couple months. Once we got hooked with them, we had a pretty tight team. So that the proponent folks, when we got to get to the point where we had to use a war game, they were fully on board, and they fully participated in the design and development, and we couldn't have done it without them. It would have been impossible. So then when we ran the game, having those uniformed officers fully on board, and they could have run the game without us, although without the TRAC folks. So what they were the main adjudicators in each room, and then the TRAC folks were the facilitators. So I like in my room, the tactical room, I kind of helped things flow. And then when there was an adjudication that we needed to clean up after a die roll or whatever, then the civil affairs officer would make that call. And so having those folks in the room, that was critical. And so as we explained the game, it really wasn't as challenging as I've been in other games. It has been challenging, but with these civil affairs folks, it wasn't really that challenging. We went through the standard. Hey, this is an overview of what the game's about. This is the sequence of play. These are the kind of assets you'll be using, etc. So we had each one of the war game rooms had a slide package that told the players how to do that. And then we ran through a practice game, like one iteration, and then we restarted the next morning. So that whole first day was like getting them immersed in the game environment. And then we restarted for actual data collection the next morning. And that's actually what I just described, that practice game was important, and it's been important in other war games we've run as well. Good question. Well, so funny that you asked that. So not this game. However, we do have a game called the Synthetic Staff Ride Mindanao, which is a diplomatic, information, military, and economic, a dime fill action PMISI state that's somewhat similar. A game that looks at Mindanao in the Philippines, and it's a 7-player game where you interact with all the players. It's kind of like a combination of diplomacy, Republic of Rome, and games like Civilization, and so. But that we have copies of that. If you're a government civilian, we'll send you one for free. If you want to buy one of those, we'd have to think about how to get you one of those. Yeah. So as one point, we did have. Okay, I'll talk to the facility. Okay, so in each room, we had. In each one of the workshops, the FAA, FNA, and FSA, we had a large number of participants. So in the FSNAA, I think we had approximately 100 people participating in the workshop. And then in the FNA, we had 80 or so participate in the workshop. And in the FSA, the war game, there were 60 or so. And in each room, the strategic, operational, tactical, and there were 15 people in the room about. Then there was some support staff that was managing the IT and the coffee and making sure everybody was in the right room and security and whatnot. So we had the support staff, so the facilitators we had in each room, typically we had 2 TRAC facilitators, and then we had 2 civil affairs proponent adjudicators / data collectors. So one of them was the adjudicator and one of them was the main data collector. We also tried to have a TRAC data collector in each room as well. So there were 5, typically 5. In my room, there were 4. I didn't have a second facilitator, but in all the other rooms, there were 5 facilitators / adjudicators in that room. And then there were approximately 10 players. And in each room, there was a threat player, a AFC threats person, and then a OP4 person, for example. And then each one of the players that represented a specific set of the forces. So there was like a SOF CA team, a guy, a SOF CA. There was a SOF period, non-CA. Then there was a SOF. There was a CA, Army Reserve CA, and then there was a maneuver force commander. And then we initially thought we'd have a green force commander like the host nation forces, but we ended up not needing that. So in each room, it was 4 or 5 people, facilitators / data collectors in each room. Yes, I absolutely did. Yeah. So right. So getting the results. So the more you do war games, the easier it becomes to do the art of transferring what you're seeing in the war game to actual narrative slash key decision points. So a trick is and this is why it's important to do practice sessions with the data collectors as one part of it is when they're capturing what the process that. So the part of the war game that you're wanting to find is why the players made the decisions, and what the key elements of the data that were part of those decisions, and then what those decisions enabled, and so or the application of some technology or whatever. Okay, so the trick is hey, you want to identify writing down key observations from what the players are saying. So it's one thing to capture their decisions. And maybe a die roll of some adjudication, but it's also important to write down what they're talking about when they're making that decision. So as you practice that more, and it's awesome to if you can, you get experienced data collectors. So for me, it's good to have some GS13s in there that have done this before, GS12s and 13s in there, and to capture that, to identify that, oh, that's an important thing I need to write down, or that's just some gals just talking about something that's not that important. You write it down to capture. And so, yes, putting those together to using that war game to build that narrative ties directly to that bar chart mitigation, more numbers kind of thing. Yes, absolutely did. So that was the important part, taking those narrative slides and putting it together with the risk mitigation numbers. That was very powerful. Right. So what we did in the thanks, Peter. So what we did in the final, so we took the narratives from the war games to describe and built those charts that had the maps on it and the narrative kind of descriptions. And then we had the solution mitigation. And then there were some other analyses we did, some of which were classified, so I couldn't show them, but that showed how other gaps were mitigated by other applications of different .mol proposed solutions. And so what we did when we built the final present report for the study and the final set of outbrief slides, we put those together to build that whole storyline. So when we were talking to the SOF commanders and the civil affairs senior leaders, and then the AFC senior leaders, we could tell them, put those things together and show them how they map to each other. And so that was, in my opinion, a very strong ability. And if you know SOF folks, they like to talk about how to get things done. And so sometimes they'd like to see quantitative stuff, but telling them that story is important. And so for us in this particular project, that was a really, it worked really well. Yeah, that's one thing I forgot to put on the slides. I apologize for that. So, yeah. So if you, my work email is very easy, and I can send you my contact information. It's just Paul, PAUL.W.works, WORKS, .civ, like civilian, CIV, Charlie, India, Victor, at mail, MAIL, .mil, MIL. So paul.w.works.civ at mail.mil. And if you just shoot me an email, I'll get, yep, there it is. Thank you. And yeah, just shoot me an email, I'll get your contact information. Absolutely. Happy to talk to anybody about any of this stuff.
Well, that looks like the end of our questions for this morning. Thank you so much, Paul, for that excellent presentation, and thank you to our attendees who submitted questions. We'll be wrapping this session up now, and you can move on to the next session, which will be starting in about 5 minutes.